Today, I invite you to travel back with me, not just decades or centuries, but tens of thousands of years into our shared human past. A time before cities, before writing, before modern medicine, a time when survival was brutal and yet, perhaps surprisingly, more compassionate than we imagine. Our focus today is on a question that reveals much about the heart of humanity. How were people with Down syndrome treated in prehistoric times, specifically during the era of the Neanderthals? At first glance, you might assume the answer is grim. After all, prehistoric life was harsh. Survival depended on strength, speed, and skill. In such a world, how could anyone with a disability survive? But science tells a deeper, more human story. In 2018, archaeologists studying a 100,000-year-old burial site in Spain made a remarkable discovery. They found the remains of a child belonging to a Neanderthal who had been born with a condition known as craniosynostosis, which is sometimes linked to developmental delays and physical differences. This child had survived for several years, long enough to require intense care and nurturing. Then came an even more astonishing discovery, a Neanderthal skeleton known as Shanidar 1, found in Iraq. This individual had survived well into old age, despite being blind in one eye, partially deaf, and having a withered arm and leg. He would have been unable to hunt or defend himself, yet he lived for decades. What does this tell us? It tells us that Neanderthals, often stereotyped as brutish and primitive, were in fact deeply social and compassionate beings. They cared for one another. They nurtured the weak, the injured, and very likely, the different. While there is no direct fossil record of a person with Down syndrome from the Neanderthal era, we now know from genetic evidence that Down syndrome-like conditions could have existed even then. And based on the care given to others with disabilities, it's not unthinkable that children born with such conditions were also cared for, loved even. Modern science and anthropology are rewriting the story of prehistoric people, not as cold survivors, but as communities bound by empathy. So why does this matter today? Because we live in a world that still struggles with inclusion. People with Down syndrome continue to face discrimination, exclusion, and misunderstanding. But if prehistoric humans, without hospitals or social services, could show compassion, then surely we, with all our advancements, can do better. Neanderthals, long portrayed as primitive and brutal, are now being reevaluated through a more compassionate and scientifically accurate lens. Archaeological evidence is reshaping our understanding of their social behavior, especially in how they treated members of their communities who were vulnerable or disabled. Among the most compelling examples is the case of individuals who survived severe injuries or congenital conditions, indicating that Neanderthals practiced long-term caregiving. These findings challenge the outdated assumption that early humans operated solely on the basis of survival of the fittest. One remarkable discovery is the skeleton known as Shanidar 1, found in a cave in northern Iraq. This individual lived around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago and exhibited multiple disabilities: a withered arm, partial blindness, hearing loss, and signs of injury. Yet, despite these significant limitations, he lived well into old age, an extraordinary feat given the physical demands of the prehistoric world. This survival would have been impossible without consistent care from others in the group, including assistance with food, shelter, and protection. Such evidence suggests that Neanderthals were not only aware of the needs of others, but were also willing to invest time and energy in helping them. This challenges the stereotype of them as emotionally limited beings, and instead paints a picture of a society capable of empathy, cooperation, and even affection. The willingness to care for those who could not contribute in traditional ways implies that Neanderthals recognized the value of individuals beyond mere physical ability. These acts of compassion may not have been driven by logic or survival strategy alone, but also by emotional bonds and social responsibility. This evolutionary backdrop reveals a deeper, more humane side of prehistoric life, where care and compassion were part of the human experience even in its earliest stages. Archaeological discoveries across the world have revealed that Neanderthals and other early human species engaged in long-term care for individuals who were injured, ill, or disabled. These findings suggest that prehistoric communities were not merely focused on survival and physical strength, but operated within deeply social and cooperative structures. This survival of individuals with significant impairments, sometimes over many years, points to a level of caregiving that involved attention, effort, and emotional commitment from others in the group. A striking example comes from the site of Dmanisi in Georgia, where a Homo erectus skull was discovered belonging to an individual who had lost all but one tooth. Despite lacking the ability to chew, this person lived for years after tooth loss, meaning that others must have prepared food or assisted in feeding. Similarly, in La Chapelle, Saints, France, a Neanderthal skeleton was found with advanced arthritis, severe tooth loss, and other debilitating conditions. Yet this person also lived to old age, again suggesting sustained care. These patterns are not isolated. They are part of a broader archaeological record that includes signs of healed bone fractures, degenerative diseases, and congenital conditions. The time and resources required to support a non-contributing group member indicate the presence of social bonds and possibly even moral frameworks. This care would have included sharing food, modifying routines to include the disabled individual, and offering physical support, all of which would require empathy and planning. The presence of burial rituals and symbolic behavior further supports the idea that early humans held deep respect for life, regardless of physical ability. These practices show that compassion and care were not modern inventions, but deeply rooted behaviors that shaped the structure and survival of early human communities. Genetic research and fossil evidence suggest that conditions resembling Down syndrome may have existed as far back as prehistoric times. While direct identification of Down syndrome in ancient remains is extremely rare due to the limitations of DNA preservation and skeletal markers, some archaeological findings provide strong indicators of congenital disorders similar in nature. Down syndrome is caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21, a condition known as trisomy 21. Though we may not yet have found conclusive proof of this exact chromosomal anomaly in Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens, studies in paleogenetics have confirmed that the fundamental structure of human chromosomes has remained largely stable for hundreds of thousands of years, making such genetic occurrences possible even in prehistoric populations. In 2023, a groundbreaking discovery was made in Spain. The remains of a child estimated to be 6 years old, dating back over 100,000 years, showed signs consistent with a congenital cranial disorder. While not definitively diagnosed as Down syndrome, the child exhibited skull shapes and growth patterns similar to those seen in modern individuals with developmental delays. This child survived several years beyond infancy, indicating that they were not abandoned or left to perish, but instead were likely cared for by their community. The level of care required would have included feeding, warmth, protection, and emotional support, which implies a deep-rooted sense of empathy and responsibility among prehistoric humans. These findings broaden our understanding of ancient societies, showing that they had the capacity to recognize and respond to developmental differences. Whether it was Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, or other hominins, the presence of such individuals within burial sites and living areas points to an inclusionary attitude that contrasts sharply with the idea that only the strong survived. The survival of individuals with disabilities in prehistoric times provides compelling evidence for the existence of social support systems among early human and Neanderthal communities. In an era where daily life was dominated by physical challenges such as hunting, migration, and harsh environmental conditions, individuals who could not contribute in conventional ways would have required continuous help to stay alive. Yet, Archaeological records reveal multiple instances where such individuals lived well beyond the age expected if they had been left to fend for themselves. This clearly indicates the presence of cooperative behavior and communal caregiving. One of the most telling examples is that of the Neanderthal individual known as Shanidar I. He suffered from a withered right arm, blindness in one eye, and likely had a hearing impairment. Despite these serious limitations, he lived into his 40s, a considerable age for that time. The extent of his disabilities meant he could not have hunted or defended himself, suggesting that others in his group provided him with food, protection, and possibly emotional companionship. This is not an isolated case. Similar examples have been found at other Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens sites, where individuals with severe injuries or congenital conditions lived for many years after the onset of their limitations. Such patterns imply that these communities went beyond basic survival instincts. They developed systems, informal but effective, for supporting vulnerable members. These systems may not have been organized like modern healthcare or welfare, but they were functional enough to ensure the survival of individuals with special needs. These support systems were likely built upon strong social bonds, including kinship, emotional attachment, and mutual reliance. The ability to care for those who could not reciprocate materially points to an advanced level of social cognition and moral development that we continue to explore and admire in our evolutionary ancestors.